You want to get through? Yeah. You think you can take these up?
Okay, welcome everyone. This is our second class in this series, Getting to Know Your Mind. So we're going to start tonight with the prayers as usual. I'll get those on the screen. And Jana, you'll be happy to lead us in those again? Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
All right.
Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, once in English. To the founder,
The endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
To the founder. Are we just doing it once?
Oh, you said once.
I'm sorry. It's because of last night.
Yeah, we'll do it two more times, sure.
To
The founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
Short mandala offering, once in English. This ground anointed
with perfumes, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land.
Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Viryataya. Refuge in Bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened.
To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly.
By
the merits I create through listening to the Dharma,
may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodam Soke Shoknam La Chanshu Bardu Dagni Kyab Suchi Dagi Chunyan Ki Fe Sonam Gi Drola Pinchir Sangye Drupar Shok Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam La Chanshu Bardu Dagni Kyab Suchi Dagi Chunyan Ki Fe Sonam Gi Drola Pinchir Sangye Drupar Shok.
Let me get the microphone on here, so make sure everybody can hear me.
So I want to ask a question about
Sure.
the prayers.
Uh-huh.
Why do they call him the destroyer?
So we had a question from
The prayers we
working
just
here.
did.
Yeah.
The foe destroyer.
Just wanting to make sure the microphone, okay. Yeah. Anne-Marie was just asking about the line in there about foe destroyer. A foe destroyer is someone who has destroyed the foe of the afflictions. So the afflictions are our enemy, they're our foe. And so that is a title that's given sometimes to those who've achieved liberation through practicing the individual vehicle, but it can also be an epithet for the Buddha, who has also destroyed that same foe, the afflictions that keep one bound in samsara, like we saw in last week's teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So So let's go ahead and do a little meditation and a reflection on the Four Noble Truths to set our motivation for our time together tonight. So we're going to begin with just a few minutes of focusing on the breath. So again, meditation is a key part of our practice. We try to calm the mind, to make the mind single-pointed, focused. So choose whatever way you prefer to work with the breath, tuning into the sensation of the breath at the nose or in the abdomen, whatever the case might be. And then as you pay attention to the breath, if you notice that the mind has wandered, then let go of whatever distracted you and guide the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime here in the Gompa to start the meditation, and then I'll come in a few minutes and I'll lead you in a short reflection on the Four Noble Truths and setting our motivation for tonight. So now let's set our motivation and begin by reflecting on the Four Noble Truths. And do this initially in regard to yourself. Really see that this is your situation that the Buddha clearly indicated in that very first teaching he gave. The first noble truth, this truth of dukkha, of dissatisfaction, sometimes translated as suffering. But again, recall that this includes not just the grosser forms of suffering that we easily identify, but even the subtler forms, the fact that what we get that causes us to have pleasure, happiness, changes. It's incapable of sustaining those feelings. It's not really a reliable support. And then the deepest level of dukkha, that we are under the control of our karma and delusions, and in that very state, we are suffering, experiencing dissatisfaction. Because as long as we're under the control of those factors, we will go from life to life. Our consciousness uniting with another set of physical components, another body, experiencing the variety of sufferings and dissatisfaction in that, and then dying and going on to another existence. This is our situation. The Buddha clearly spelled it out. And the second noble truth, the causes of that, where does it come from? Our own minds. We like to blame things on the outside for causing us to have problems and difficulties. But the Buddha says that we are the creator of our experiences. Through the root of ignorance, we engage in various states of mind, both wholesome and unwholesome. Those bring forth virtuous and non-virtuous actions, karma, which then bring about their results of happiness and suffering. Causes of our experience in this state of dissatisfaction, dukkha, are within our very own minds, and this is why we're engaging in this topic of getting to know our minds, to know how we can change our minds and remove those causes of dukkha. And that leads us into the last two truths, that there is the possibility of freedom from all of this. There can be a cessation of that dissatisfaction, the attainment of the state of peace, nirvana. And to do that, we have to engage in the fourth noble truth, the true path that leads to that complete cessation of everything that is unsatisfactory. And part of that path is to know our minds and to eventually be rid of the disturbing states of mind that are counterproductive, that only cause us to have more and more suffering, dissatisfaction. So initially want this for yourself. There's nothing wrong with that wish. We've been in cyclic existence since beginningless time. Make that heartfelt wish to be free of that, all the causes of dukkha and the state where we experience that dissatisfaction, lifetime after lifetime. But then generate the larger motivation to think that we're here because we see that others are in the same predicament as ourselves, under the control of these factors, simply wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer, but never finding the true causes to accomplish those wishes. So we want to become a Buddha, a fully enlightened being, so we can guide those beings, lead them on the path that will help them to attain their complete enlightenment, their freedom from suffering, from dukkha, but moreover, the fulfillment of all their positive qualities in the state of Buddhahood. So this is the motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha, to benefit all beings. And so we think that we're here again tonight to engage in this topic of getting to know our own minds with that motivation, the wish to be able to benefit all sentient beings, so that everything we do tonight becomes a cause for that result. You can open your eyes fully and begin the class. So I did want to mention, I actually forgot to put on the drive that you all have a link to. Again, if you go to the website, ktbctaos.org, you'll find that link. That I did put out there the presentation slides from last week. I forgot to do that until today. And I might mention that last week I also forgot to mention at the end of the class the reading assignment. And again, this is just optional. You don't have to do all of this reading. This is just if you want to follow along with that book that I mentioned, the one by Venerable Thupten Gyatso. The reading assignments in the last slide. So these were just some pages that pertain to what I had talked about. And there was some optional reading if you really wanted to get into chapters 4 and 5, sections 4 and 5 of this first part. They weren't ones that I was going to touch on in this course because they go beyond the scope of what we're mainly focusing on here, which is the mind, consciousness, and so on. And then the third part was really just more part 3 there at the bottom, ways of knowing. That's a bit of what I'm going to cover tonight. So sometimes with the reading assignment, some of it is to really prepare for what you're going to hear. And other times it's, to review what I have already taught. But in terms of the drive, I just might mention that there is the handout that I will be talking about a little bit tonight. I think we'll be getting into the mental factors later tonight. I'll show you that. But once more, these are the texts. And I just might want to go through these really briefly so you know this is just a supplementary text. This is not something you have to read. It gives another presentation of these mental factors. And it's done by one of the monks in our tradition. I think it's called Happy Monks Publications. They do these translations of various texts. And anyway, I don't need to say too much about it, but it's not really something you have to read. It's just an extra piece of literature that you might find useful. And it is on our reading list. But as the reading list says, when we make that larger, the main text is this, The World and Ourselves, which is what I'm going to be referring to and citing passages from. And then again, there's a little piece on minds and mental factors, a teaching by Lama Yeshe on a few of the mental factors. That's the text number 3 that I just had on the screen. And then these other 2 are books that you may find useful, but they go much deeper into things. So this is just an additional kind of resource saying, don't think that you have to read all these things because it really is not so essential. This is the book again that we're using for the main text. So I don't need to say much more about that. I introduced you to that last week. And then this is that teaching by Lama Yeshe, which is really quite sweet. Many of you have read teachings by Lama Yeshe, and this one's no different in terms of his very personable way of approaching the Dharma. So I'm hoping you might find those resources useful. But again, these are really just supplementary resources. The main one is the book that we're working with, and you don't even have to read that. This is mainly to be able to have something else you can refer to as we go through this. Yeah, Stella.
John, I'm reading the wisdom chapter of Shantideva at home. And I know that's, part of, it has to do with the mind, right? And so it keeps talking about the different schools, the Prasangita, the Madhyamika, and all. Is it important for us to really know the distinctions of that? Because when we talk about the mind.
Yeah. Well, again, Stella's asking, I don't know if you heard online, but she's reading in her home reading, she's reading the wisdom chapter of Master Shantideva, which is the most difficult chapter. It's chapter 9 of that text. And yeah, it does deal with the mind, but it's mainly about the wisdom of emptiness, which we will touch on. And I'm even going to talk a little bit about it tonight, not a whole lot. And I even alluded to it a bit last week, but these different schools or tenet systems that are set out in there, Vaibhashika and Sautantrika and Chittamatra, Madhyamika, and all, those are another whole study that can be done. And this course that I'm kind of doing an abbreviated version of for all of you is part of what we call the FPMT Basic program, which is not basic in terms of introductory. It's basic in terms of the text that Lama Zopa Rinpoche feels we should all study at some point if we're serious about engaging in this tradition. And Shantideva's text is one of those that is included. Another text is a presentation of tenets, which is going into more detail about these 4 main philosophical systems. It's a very heady topic, but it's one that is useful just to gain some appreciation for the way that the Buddha taught in different levels and in different ways. Most of us come into this tradition and we immediately go right into the deep end of Prasangika Madhyamika, which is said to be the final view of the Buddha. And that's what this tradition subscribes to. They say, if you want to attain liberation or enlightenment, you have to know that view of emptiness. So it makes sense to teach that. But in fact, the Buddha taught many things that precede that can kind of help us to move closer and closer to that view. And most of us don't even necessarily study those. So I think it is useful definitely to know them and to work with them. But it's quite an undertaking. There are a number of texts that do provide a presentation of tenets. I've taught it at least once or twice before. It's something that, again, is worthwhile pursuing if you want to get really serious into the study, and particularly with Shantideva's chapter, where he does have different points of view being set out and then being refuted and what have you. It can be a little confusing if you don't have some grounding in those. But again, in terms of what we really need to know, what we're working with here and the particular point of view of Prasangika Madhyamaka is the one we need to know and we need to practice, because it's said to be the final wisdom we need to develop, the final view to be able to be free of samsara and to attain enlightenment. So I don't want to discount all that study, because Lama Zopa Rinpoche felt it was really important to know these systems, these tenet systems. But again, we do what we can. So don't feel like if it's something that seems too cumbersome and difficult to take on, that's okay. Maybe there'll be a time later when you can do that, or maybe in another lifetime you can do that. Don't stress out too much about it. But yeah, we can talk more about it later as well, Stella. Okay, so what we did in the first class, again, we did touch on the Four Noble Truths and kind of the Buddhist worldview, if you will, what's going on here. And I was emphasizing that in particular because, once more, it points to the fact that our minds are the problem. And in particular, the root of ignorance. We will touch on that. One of the classes down the way, we will definitely spend some time looking at ignorance and various types of ignorance, but mainly the ignorance that is what's trapping us in this round of existence, going from life to life, that is overcome and eventually annihilated through the wisdom realizing emptiness, according to that final point of view. So we will be going into all of that in much, much more detail. But the point of last week was really to get us to understand that the workshop is our minds then. And so it's really essential that we know our minds. So I did begin talking a little bit about kind of the mind and the nature of the mind and so on. I didn't go too deeply into it. I want to pick up tonight with talking about the two main types of consciousnesses we have. We're going to, a little bit later tonight, hopefully we'll get into that, we're going to divide mind into main minds and mental factors. And I'll define what we mean by a mental factor later. That's the main topic we're going to be getting into in this course, is picking apart the mind and understanding all the various components of it. But we have these essential main minds that can be divided into two main categories. They encompass 6 total consciousnesses, but they involve the 5 sense consciousnesses that we tend to lump together because they are all produced through our sensory experiences of things in our world. And then on the other hand, we have what we call our mental consciousness. Now, our mental consciousness can know in the same way that our sensory consciousness does, but it tends to be very much about conceptual mind. And we're going to go into that delineation now. The rest of tonight, we're going to kind of move into a little bit more of a discussion of the way that we work with our conceptual mind to produce the correct knowledge and eventually be free of all of this, because I think it's important to touch on that. Venerable Gyatso does do that in the beginning of his text. And then we're going to get into the mental factors. We're going to begin to understand. We're going to do a little bit more of kind of the mechanics of the mind, if you will, tonight, and maybe into the beginning of next week. But then we're going to move into the more nitty-gritty stuff that we really want to focus on. But it's important to understand those mechanics of the mind as well. So let's go to our slides first. Again, in the slides, I did show once more that reading assignment, so you have it to refer to in your presentation slides on the drive. For session 2, we're going to start with this ways of knowing. There's a whole part of Venerable Gyatso's book, The World and Ourselves, where he goes into ways of knowing. And the main thing is to delineate the difference between these two, our sense consciousnesses and mental consciousness. So let's go to the actual text. Let me put that on the screen and we'll start there. Okay, so this is the beginning of that part, part 3. Whoops, went too far. Sorry. Let me get a little bit further up there. Why it went down so far, and then if I go back with the full thing, it takes it too far up. Here we are. Okay, the 5 sense consciousnesses. I think I have to move it over a little bit too. It's kind of moved to the right, or yeah, to the left. Okay, there we go. Let me push this up All right. The five sense consciousnesses. To understand sensory awareness, he says, look at the blueness of the sky, for example, or we can choose anything that's in your immediate space. And with your eye consciousness, you can look at a particular color, for example. Eye consciousness is what knows color and shape. So you can observe blue, for example, and pay attention to your subjective experience of the color blue. Almost immediately, you will start thinking about it or about something entirely unrelated. This means that your visual perception of blue has faded and your conceptual mental consciousness has been activated and is thinking about the sky or perhaps even some other thing because you've gotten distracted. If you stop that sequence of thoughts and go back to the simple visual experience of blue sky again and again, you will become more familiar with the meaning of what we call here non-conceptual visual perception, or often called direct visual perception. So let me take it off screen and just talk about this. The Buddha says that essentially our five sense consciousnesses are more like portals for simply receiving raw data from the world around us. So when we talk about our eye consciousness or visual consciousness, it is essentially through the force of our eyes being in tune with receiving the various stimulation from the world around us in terms of color and shape, of receiving that data. And that's all that's really going on. Our sensory consciousnesses, we don't call them dumb necessarily, but they're not involved in knowing things so much. They are simply receiving that data and will bring that information in. The processing of that data is what's happening in our conceptual mind. And that's the main territory. Well, it's only within mental consciousness, and it's the main way that our mental consciousness is active. I'm going to go on to talk about mental consciousness shortly. But you can see this for yourself, how very quickly this raw data that we bring in suddenly takes the shape of thoughts about that. We see something like when John and I left the restaurant, it was really quite beautiful, the time of day with the sun just about setting and everything was kind of orange. That orange isn't just received as like this, sensory experience. It goes into my eye consciousness and is just pure raw data. It immediately, I start putting things on. Oh, that's so beautiful. That's so nice. I hope it lasts for a while or whatever, all the thoughts that go around that. One of the mindfulness exercises that I had hoped to assign for you last week had to do with this because I was hoping to cover this before we finished last week. But it's to become aware of that process. Think of how quickly we go from just the raw data experience of these things to the thinking about it. Now, the thinking about it is what we're going to be moving into and talking about because the thinking about it can become erroneous. It can become faulty and even harmful. And it can also be a way of being liberated. It depends upon how we think about things. We have that wonderful phrase, don't believe everything you think. Well, it's true. A lot of the thoughts we make up are distorted. They're not really thinking about things in a correct way. But that raw data that comes in almost immediately gets analyzed and gets pigeonholed and all sorts of other things. This is how we decide this is bad, this is good, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. All of that is a thought process. And it all happens very, very quickly. When we talk about the mechanics of the mind later, we'll see how much you have in every single moment of mind, a variety of things that are arising that help you in this process of delineating and differentiating the various things that you are involved with in your world that are primarily coming through that raw data, through your sense consciousnesses, and then being immediately processed, immediately made into something that we think about. Yes, Ed.
Is the concept pure consciousness?
Mhm.
Is that the absence of the thinking?
When we use the term, Ed's asking about the term pure consciousness, when we do talk about the kind of purity of the mind at its most fundamental level, and we would say that that would be the level that we would have a freedom from conceptual entrapments. In different Buddhist traditions, and we're following a Tibetan Buddhist tradition here, but I think I don't know enough about Zen to make sure that this is 100% correct, but it does seem that the Zen process is often in meditating about ridding oneself of thoughts. And certainly in Tibetan Buddhism, there is a goal in our meditation to achieve something where we are no longer bound by conceptual mind. It's said when you attain Buddhahood, you don't have a conceptual mind. The conceptual mind is something that is with a mind that is together with ignorance. It is the way that we process all the information, whereas a Buddha's mind knows everything directly. There's no conceptual overlay at all. So essentially, conceptual mind can be free. We can be free of that in a pure state, a state where we have removed all the things that pollute our minds. But yeah, pure consciousness, again, depends upon how that term is used. The way I would be thinking of it is, again, when you have gotten down to that very level of mind, it's no longer conceptual. It's what we call in Tantra the clear light mind. The clear light mind is that pure mind that is knowing things in a non-conceptual way. So it's a very different experience. Because our mental consciousness can know things directly as well. Let's jump back to our sense consciousnesses for just a moment and discussing what you brought up, Ed. Our sense consciousnesses are knowing that data quite directly. Like the colors and shapes and everything around us are appearing to our eye consciousness in that direct way. There's no kind of medium between our eye consciousness and what the colors and shapes that it is knowing. It's a direct stimulation of that and known in that way. Our conceptual mind, on the other hand, and we're going to see this in the presentation in a moment, is knowing things through what we call a mental image, an idea of things. Don't think that because I use the word image that it means only things that are visual, because we have our auditory consciousness as well, our ear consciousness. You can think right now about the sound of the chime I made before the class, right? Or about any instrument. So think of the sound of a cello, for example, or the sound of an electric guitar, or whatever it is that you want. You can think about those things, but you are not experiencing the actual strumming of an electric guitar or the playing of a cello or whatever the case might be. You have an idea of it, an image of it that your mind has from your having experienced it that you are now working with. And you go, oh yeah, I remember when I heard, Yo-Yo Ma's cello suites of Bach, and blah, 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 blah. You can think about those and how wonderful they were, but you're not listening to them at the time. This is the domain of our mental consciousness. It's knowing things conceptually, always through something that is kind of between us and the actual object. So the consciousness is knowing an idea of the cello suites, or an idea of the taste of a strawberry, for example, or the idea of the smell of roses. All of these things we can bring to mind in our mental consciousness, but we're doing so through a mental image. And even when we start working with something in the moment, like Venerable Gyatso was saying, we see the color blue and suddenly we start thinking about it. Oh, that's a really nice blue. And, I guess I would like to paint my room that color or something. You start going off on a tangent. Even when we're experiencing something in the moment, we tend to immediately go into an idea of things. This mental image is not the real thing. We're doing this with everything. I mean, it becomes really problematic when we start doing it with people. We hear somebody talking and saying something, and suddenly we have an idea of that person. That is not who they are. I mean, we're experiencing raw data. That's, again, their appearance, the visual form, their sound of their voice, the things that they are saying. And we're processing all of that, and we're coming up with an idea. Somebody I really like, somebody I don't like so much, whatever the case might be. Our conceptual mind is the main culprit in terms of creating problems for us, because it's taking all of that sensory data and then also all the other thoughts that we've generated, and it's working with ideas of things that are not the real thing. They are distant from the thing. And so in that way, we are overlaying on stuff, ideas about things that are often off the mark. We kind of build on top of that, and then we create all these kinds of problems. So back to your question, Ed, you can have a mental consciousness that is free of all those trappings, that is no longer involved in all of those, and knowing things in a much purer way. And if we're using the term pure consciousness, to refer to those moments when through deep meditation we can know things as they are in a much more purified way, well then yes, we can attain that. Right now, our sense consciousnesses sort of have that because they're knowing things directly, but they're not intelligent consciousnesses. They're just, once more, receptors for all that raw data. All that's coming in, and then we are processing it with the machine of our minds, that is the conceptual awareness, that is, once more, looking at things through this idea of them rather than knowing them directly. And a Buddha's mind actually is free of all of that. A Buddha's mind knows everything directly. no longer trapped by conceptual mind. But again, the thing I wanted to point out, which I just mentioned a short while, it's also our conceptual mind that can be corrected. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. The fact that we can move away from wrong ideas of things to actually knowing them in a much more realistic way. And in some cases, like emptiness and so on, we can actually know them directly, absolutely, even before we become a Buddha. So I don't know. Hopefully that answered your question. So let's go back to the text just to read a little bit more, because I think this does get into even some of the teachings about how things don't have, have their nature from their own side, that they are actually kind of a process that we come up with an idea about things. It says here, then analyze the relationship between your visual consciousness and its object. What is blue? We experience the color blue when electromagnetic waves of a certain frequency strike our retina and an electrical signal is sent to the optical region of the brain. Those electromagnetic waves or photons are not the color blue. The electrical signal from the retina is not the color blue. The chemicals that transfer the signal from one neuron to another are not the color blue. Even the subjective awareness of blue is not the color blue. Awareness is mind, and mind is not a physical thing like the color blue, right? For us, the color blue is experienced when there is a conjunction between those particular light rays, our visual apparatus, and our visual consciousness. It is the object of that awareness, and even though the light rays are external to our body and mind, there is no color blue whatsoever existing independently of our mind. This is really getting into the deeper truths that, as I said, are pointing to emptiness. When we talk about something being blue, it is contingent upon our identification of that as blue. It is us, through our conceptual mind, designating that as blue, that then blue exists. But this whole process, even just examining what's happening when we're knowing the taste of a strawberry, for example, to put that on your tongue, you will have the same sort of things happening, right? You've got something that is based on the strawberry being there, that object, that is then received by your sort of tongue receptors, right? The taste receptors, that then goes into triggering our taste consciousness. And then the mental consciousness begins to conceptualize all around that and says, oh, this is strawberry, right? Like if somebody said, close your eyes, I'm going to put something on your tongue that you'll like, and put it on your tongue, you go, oh, strawberry, right? Your recollection of having had that experience previously allows you to correctly identify that and so on. But strawberry doesn't exist on its own, independent of all that coming together and us saying, oh, that's strawberry, right? So this is kind of already pointing to, when we begin to examine what's happening with our sensory consciousness and even with our mental consciousness, we begin to see that there is a contingency, particularly upon mind, designating and knowing kind of then what we are experiencing, giving a label to that, giving an idea to all of that. Emptiness means that things don't have that identity from their own side, that they don't exist independently, that the taste of a strawberry isn't something out there concrete in that red fruit with the little seeds on it. That is contingent upon a being like us putting it on their tongue, experiencing it, identifying the taste of strawberry, right? The taste of strawberry isn't inherent within that object. It is contingent upon this whole process. Again, I don't want to go too far down this philosophical rabbit hole, but I like that he's already at the very beginning, when he's just talking about simply how our consciousnesses know, pointing out that there's a deeper thing going on here. It's not just some external experience that we're having that exists sort of independent of the mind. So it goes on to say then people with normal vision will all agree, that the color blue exists. And they know what is suitable to be called blue. I mean, there are some people with who are colorblind who might have a different experience of what we mean by blue, right? Might see it in shades of gray or what have you. They agree that most days the sky appears to be blue. But the sky is a mixture of colorless gases, and it cannot be the color blue. The color blue exists, but it doesn't exist within the mind or as the outer conditions that give rise to the experience of blue. We cannot say where it exists, so the question is, how does it exist? When experienced by visual consciousness, those electromagnetic waves of a certain frequency are suitable to be called blue. But they are not blue in their own right. Blue only comes into existence when a visual consciousness is initiated by those waves, and we say, I see blue. Without that mental experience and without the label blue, the color blue does not exist. I don't know if people are seeing this, but I think it's really quite a nice way to introduce this idea that, again, is a much deeper truth that we'll get to in this course. But again, it's already speaking to what is happening at a very basic level with any of our experiences through our senses. You can make similar analyses of your other senses by focusing on the sound of a flute, the taste of chocolate, the smell of a flower, or the touch of a smooth object. The taste of chocolate is something you experience when a mixture of certain chemicals comes in contact with the taste buds. And a signal is sent to the brain, right? So it triggers your taste consciousness of chocolate. Each chemical alone or their mixture is not chocolate taste. The electrical signal is not chocolate taste, and so on. You should try to ascertain what it is that you call chocolate taste. Does chocolate taste exist independently of your mind? Your mind needs to be experiencing that and labeling it as chocolate taste to know that chocolate taste exists. This is again getting to this deeper truth, the way that things arise and are identified and they exist in dependence upon various factors. And the subtlest way that they exist is they depend upon our minds, conceptualizing these various experiences, organizing our world. Oh, that's chocolate, and that's strawberry, and that's vanilla, and that's Neapolitan, and whatever. So the idea is that without our being involved in the world, really, there's nothing from the side of all of that. That's what we mean by emptiness. Things don't have that identity from their own side. That identity is contingent upon all of those causes and conditions coming together and us going, oh, that's the taste of chocolate. That's the color blue. Yeah, Stella.
How much of that is the monkey mind, though?
Well,
because
Yeah.
I'm at the point. I mean, I don't know how I can say it, but it's about the thoughts coming into the mind. It's like
right.
sometimes there's so many thoughts,
right.
and it's like, how important are they really?
Right.
And are they preventing us from getting to a more peaceful state? You
Well,
know what I
and
mean?
this is what we're going to be examining in this course. Stella's bringing up the idea, well, how much of all this thinking about things is part of the monkey mind and the distractions that keep us from really knowing things as they are? Well, a good share of it, right? But, at just the level of identification of things, it's really not that faulty, right? When we just say, oh, that's a computer because it's got the shape and the colors and everything and the functionality of computer, and that's a strawberry and that's chocolate. Identifying things in our world is a necessary part of being in the world. My gosh, if we didn't identify things, you'd go to the store and you'd like try to, I want, well, what is it you want? What you don't know what the other person calls what you want. You've never figured out what to call it. We need language to get along with each other and to communicate and be able to again, I use this phrase, my Tibetan teachers never said it, to organize our world. Right? The world needs to be organized in some way. This is this, that is that, whatever. And then we can all kind of get along on at least the basis of what we call things. But as you're pointing out, a lot of the other stuff we layer on top of it, oh, those are really horrible strawberries, and that's really a delicious chocolate and whatever. All this stuff that we kind of put on top of it is a creation of our own minds that can be very distracting. And it can also induce different delusions, different distorted states of mind. Like when we see that as a really delicious chocolate, then we get attachment for it. We go to the store and buy 50 of those chocolate bars because we're afraid they're going to disappear and everyone else is going to get them and I'm not going to get them. And right, so we have this mind of attachment and craving and grasping that can arise on the basis of all these thoughts that we put on top of a simple thought of that's chocolate. That's the taste of chocolate. So I agree, but that's what we're trying to do in this course is to really say, okay, what is the extra stuff I put on top that is problematic, that is inducing these distorted states of mind, so that I then am having an unhealthy relationship with all the stuff in my work. Okay. So this idea again, but this is, I think people are getting it. I don't know that you have to get everything about the paragraphs I just read. But let's go down to the bottom here where it says, with regard to mental consciousness, you can also try a similar analysis of your conceptual sense of self or I. Like when somebody insults you and you angrily reply, don't say that about me. You know, how does the aggrieved I appear to your mind at that time? You know, when you have somebody said something that you disagree with, where and how does that apparent self exist? Why is your self-image so insecure that it requires such an aggressive defense? I mean, this is getting to the deeper way that we are caught up in samsara, and the root of our suffering is really this grasping at a false sense of an I, a self. We're going to get into this as we get into some of these other distorted states of mind, right? Because those are where the real problem is coming into play. We think we are this real independent entity, and we keep bumping up against everybody else to get what we want and to avoid what brings us unhappiness and suffering. And yeah, I mean, the fundamental quest to be happy and to not suffer, there isn't a problem there. But the way we're going about it with this distorted sense of self is really problematic. It's really not going to be beneficial in the end. And it's what has been keeping us in samsara since beginningless time. So let's talk a little bit about conceptual consciousness. Again, there are some forms of mental consciousness that can know things directly in the same way we were talking about with our sense consciousnesses, but in a manner of wisdom, not in the sort of unintelligent way that our sense consciousnesses work. But conceptual consciousness, as I was saying earlier, knows things in a very different way. Thinking or conceptualizing is awareness of things that arises in dependence upon a mental image of the object, like I said earlier. Unlike our sensory perceptions, which know their objects directly without an intervening mental image, that raw data, that taste of strawberries appearing to the tongue sense, without any intermediary, any mental image between them. Conceptions, on the other hand, are mental consciousnesses that apprehend their objects indirectly through the appearance of an idea of the object. Right? That's what we tend to work with, and we always work with our conceptual mind. It starts with maybe a direct perception through our senses, and then suddenly it becomes an idea of the object. He goes on to talk about how this kind of mental images can be divided into two further types. He says, for example, if we've never heard of Superman, we can conceive an idea of him just by hearing his name and a description, right? Somebody could say, oh, this is what Superman is like. A better example might be like India. Maybe you've never traveled to India. And so somebody could say, oh, in India, there's this and there's that, and this is what it's like on the streets of India, whatever. And you get an idea of it, right? But until you go to India, you don't really know exactly what India is like, right? Then you have the direct experience of India through all the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, whatever tactile sensations of India that are bombarding you at the time, right? So he says here, without more information, our mental image cannot be accurate. But if we have the fortune to go to India or to actually meet Superman, we can connect the idea generated by their name with a more accurate image derived from having seen Superman or having been to India. Thus, we can say that thought is a conceiving consciousness that apprehends these two ideas, two images, one from it being named and thought about, where someone describes it to us or whatever, and then the other one from experience. It apprehends those as suitable to be combined. That they are different layers of getting at things, one perhaps a bit more accurate than the other, but nonetheless, both of them still in the territory of an idea. It's still an idea that we have of things. Yes, there's some value to having the direct experience through your senses of the sights and sounds of India and so on, but you still have an idea of India on the basis of that. Yeah, Stella.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but I just had this sense of what you're saying, and it really came to me that you can see things with the with the visual consciousness. For example, you can see pictures and then you know what it's like in India. But when I went to Nepal, my nose, that consciousness, my smell consciousness,
Sure,
was something that I never could have gotten from a picture.
sure.
So,
Yeah.
and that's just what you're saying. And so it's really true that you have to experience some things directly to really know them.
Sure. No, Stella's just pointing out, if you didn't hear online, that when you have an idea of something, you might get some idea of what India or Nepal is like from a picture, but that picture doesn't convey the full experience of the smells and the tastes and whatever, all the stuff that's going on all around you and everything. And again, the idea here is that still we can, and both of those can end up being ideas or images, because once more, whenever our conceptual mind gets involved, whether we're thinking about something that we only know through an idea of it, or something that we have experienced that still translates into an idea, it's still through an idea, it's still through an image. Our image can become a bit more correct, right? When you go to Nepal and you get all of the various things through your senses, and you get a greater understanding of what it really is like to be on the streets of Nepal. And that can be different even from one street to another too, right? But nonetheless, the point is that the conceptual mind is always bound by this idea of a mental image. Our sense consciousness has taken that raw data, and then our mental consciousness, through our conceptual mind particularly, processes that and comes up with ideas about it. Because you can have some people, like I had a friend of mine who came to New Mexico and thought it was really awful, would never want to be here, right? And we all have, I am assuming all of you are still here living in New Mexico because you really love what New Mexico is. And that idea that we both have mental images of the same thing in a sense. The raw data appeared to my friend, and that raw data was translated in thoughts that were like, not a good place to live, And who wants all that desert and whatever. So again, this is what our conceptual minds are doing. They're always working with an idea of it. And in our case, we saw the idea of what New Mexico was, and we like it. And we're happy to be here and what have you. Quite content living here. Again, this is the nature of our conceptual mind. The conceptual minds, again, will not know the thing directly, but they can certainly influence the way that we work with things and the way that we then understand our world. So it says here, this is very important. Through our preconceptions, we distort the reality of almost everything, right? Conceptions, I don't think I read the sentence just before that. Conception, right about the middle of the screen. Conceptions may have wrong or correct understanding of their object. They can be either, but even correct conceptions have an element of error, in that the conceiving mind confuses its mental image of the object with the actual object. So, how we know something and think of something is what we overlay on that object. And then, the sentence I just read, the two sentences there, this is very important. Through our preconceptions, we actually distort the reality of almost everything. So I'm just pointing this out because this is really the domain that we're working in. All of what we call our deluded states of mind, these distorting minds, are conceptions. They are ideas about things that start off working with the idea about that object. I mean, many of you know that I used to use Brussels sprouts as like an example of something where I had a really horrible mental image of that food, right? And it was based on the experiences I had with that food. When my mom would steam them at home or something and put this steaming bowl of Brussels sprouts in front of me, and I wanted nothing to do with them. The smell, everything was like disgusting to me. Well, some years ago, somebody roasted them for me, and suddenly I like Brussels sprouts. I've taken a different mental image. Of course, it's a different way of preparing them too, but I have now a different idea in my mind around Brussels sprouts. None of these things are fixed. They can change in time, and that shows the nature of our conceptual mind as well. What we're trying to do in this course isn't around Brussels sprouts necessarily, but it's about how we do have wrong conceptions of things. And we do have ways of looking at things that induce these distorted states of mind. And we also could have correct ways of looking at things, and we could be having a very healthy relationship to all the things in our world. It all comes down to our mind, and our conceptual mind is the initial workshop. I'm going to point out in a moment how that conceptual mind can begin to move us away from wrong ideas all the way to bridging its way eventually into a direct perception, a direct knowledge of things, where you're no longer dealing with that mental image that comes between you and the object. And that's the goal. All the Buddhist practice is really to get us to that non-conceptual awareness, that pure consciousness, if you want to call it that, Ed, that is at the root of all of this, that is clouded in a sense by all of these conceptions that, again, can be correct, can be incorrect, but they keep us from knowing things directly. They keep us from knowing reality directly. So let's go to that. Let me put on the slides for just a moment, because I want to introduce this next section. The progression of awarenesses. This is what Venerable Gyatso goes into right after introducing sensory consciousnesses and mental consciousness. Again, mental consciousness does have some ways of directly knowing. That's the whole point of this, that you can get to that place as well. But mental consciousness for us is mainly conceptual mind. It's mainly our thinking about things. So I'm going to introduce this to you and go through it. And I want to, well, maybe I should do it first with an example. What the Buddha says is that we all start out with some wrong ideas or conceptions. You know, and let me use the example that most of us experienced when we were children, right? Somebody introduced us to the wrong idea of there being a Santa Claus. I'm not saying Santa Claus is a concept, right? A real person who lives in the North Pole, who on Christmas Eve gets in a sled drawn by reindeer that goes up in the sky and that delivers packages, Christmas presents to all the kids around the world. Okay? We all grew up with that myth, right? That wrong idea. And we're really excited, Santa Claus is going to come to my house and I'm going to put out cookies and all that. We start off with that wrong idea. Well, doubt has 3 stages. We'll talk about these in a moment. But doubt is where we begin to say, oh, I don't know, is there a Santa Claus or isn't there a Santa Claus? Kind of beginning to think that maybe there still is. I really would like there to be a Santa Claus, but, it's starting to sound a little unrealistic, maybe. Or maybe other kids are talking about, oh, there is no Santa Claus. So you start entertaining that doubt. Eventually that doubt starts moving towards the more correct view that there isn't a Santa Claus, but you don't really think that yet. You're still in that doubting phase. The third bullet point there is your correct belief or assumption, where you kind of think about it and you go, well, all these kids are saying Santa Claus doesn't exist, and it does sound kind of fishy. I don't think Santa Claus really exists. And as painful as that is for a child to say, this myth they believed in for all those years doesn't exist, you kind of get to that place where you have that correct belief. Valid inference is a fancy words for kind of you through reasoning coming to that conclusion. So this is maybe where you've gotten the idea that Santa Claus doesn't exist, but you haven't really thought about it at that deeper level. But when you sit down one night and you're suddenly going, this whole idea of like this guy getting up in a sleigh that's drawn by reindeers that fly and that, is somehow in the course of an evening able to deliver all these packages around the world or whatever, you start thinking about it and you go, this isn't rational. This doesn't really make sense. You reason it through and you come to the conclusion, Santa Claus cannot exist because this is just not something that sounds possible, sounds doable. Then you decide, well, Christmas is coming up and you want to prove it to yourself once and for all. So you sneak down in the middle of the night and sure enough, you see your parents putting the presents underneath the tree. There's no Santa Claus coming down the reindeer or the chimney, with the reindeer on top of the house or whatever. You get it's called here a yogic direct perception. That's what we call it in Buddhism when I'm going to frame it around emptiness and realizing emptiness. But just any direct perception can be the way of proving something to ourselves, right? We go downstairs and we see, oh, there's my parents, putting the presents underneath the tree. Well, there's no Santa Claus then. I was wrong in believing in Santa Claus all these years. You might even accuse your parents of abusing you through implanting such a myth in your mind. But I use it here for Santa Claus just as a way of entertaining these ideas. It doesn't hold completely, like I said, especially with regard to the last one. But this is how they're traditionally explained. The wrong idea or conception in regard to emptiness, the idea is first, a person strongly holds themselves, that sense of an I, and all persons and all phenomena really, to be inherently existent, to exist from their own side in the way that I was talking about earlier tonight, kind of being able to set themselves up, their identities from the side of the object. That's contrary to how persons and other phenomena actually exist. The Buddha says we have had that wrong idea since beginningless time. How do we move away from that? Well, by entertaining some doubts. Then, through hearing about emptiness and or reflecting on its meaning, a doubting consciousness is generated in 3 stages. First, doubt that leans towards the incorrect, the weakening of the wrong awareness a little, so the practitioner thinks that persons probably are inherently existent, but begins to suspect they may not be. This is what happens when you begin to be introduced to the idea of emptiness. Maybe that's happening for some of you tonight in hearing this. You're beginning to go, well, maybe things don't exist in the way that I think they do, or the way that they appear, and so on. Then that doubt becomes more equal, where the practitioner, is finally thinking, well, maybe they do exist inherently, maybe they don't. You're kind of in the middle ground there between the two. Before you were leaning towards the wrong view. Now you're beginning to move away from that to the middle. The last stage of doubt, obviously, is when you lean toward the correct. The practitioner eventually thinks that persons are probably not inherently existent. So far we've seen like a conceptual mind begin to turn away from what is the wrong view towards what is the correct view. But it's only in the point still of being doubt. Doubt is kind of a two-pointed mind. It hasn't yet determined the correct view, but it's leaning towards it, saying, well, they probably aren't inherently existent because I've been hearing about this, hearing more teachings, doing some reasoning myself, and it just seems like that's the case. Correct belief or assumption based on further listening, studying, and contemplation on emptiness of inherent existence induces a correct belief, a conceptual understanding of persons as empty of inherent existence, which can be generated through the process of inference. That's reasoning. That's through the reasons that we have set out in the study of emptiness, which we'll get into a little bit when we get to that topic later in this course. But it's not yet a valid inference because it's not incontrovertible. You know, as people begin with working some of these reasonings that we have, they do start feeling some conviction that that is how things exist. They don't have that existence from their own side, because when we start working with different objects and analyzing them, we begin to see that there's nothing from the side of whatever it is, like this little bell ringer, that makes it a bell ringer, that it's coming from the side of the person imputing that idea on this. Or like the blue we were talking about earlier, just in that discussion around blue in the sky. And where is that blue? That blue is coming from the mind that is labeling that blue. There's nothing from the side of that sky that is blue from its own side. So you get a correct belief, but that correct belief needs to have more ground to it. It needs to become incontrovertible. That's through reasoning. When you reason again and again and again, and you keep coming to the same conclusion, you get to a point. Incontrovertible means you cannot be swayed from that. You get deep conviction in yourself that this is how things exist. They are empty of inherent existence. They exist by, mere dependence upon thought and conceptualization. Then we finally get to, so this is the next one, then the one I was just mentioning, valid inference, penetrating more and more through reasoning and analysis on emptiness of inherent existence, and inferential valid cognition. Again, that's the fancy term for this very solid reasoning process that we go through, which is conceptual still, but incontrovertible, meaning, again, you cannot be swayed from that. That is induced. So that is the process that again, this is all conceptual mind up to this point. Your conceptual mind will take you out of those wrong concepts you had through doubt, through correct belief, through this valid inference, and get you to having the conviction that emptiness is reality, that is how things actually exist. Eventually, through your concentration, you develop yogic direct perception. That's why it's called yogic. It involves yoga's, meditative yoga's practices where we are meditating on particular topics, in this case, emptiness. The practitioner continues to remain in this conceptual cognition on emptiness of the person as long as possible. And having developed special insight based on the meditative stabilization of calm abiding, you need a very deep state of meditation. To do this, you progress eventually toward the yogic direct perception of emptiness. That is an unmistakable experience, they say. I've not had this experience myself. Even the Dalai Lama, when he talks, says, oh, no, I have some idea of emptiness, but I haven't had this. But, this is an what's the word I was going to use? Unmistakable experience. When you have that, you know that you have that direct insight into emptiness, because it's not through the force of an idea of emptiness. What you've been doing up to this point is generating an idea of emptiness. When you start the process of doubt, that idea of emptiness is a little not so well formed. It's and then when you get correct belief, it's a little better. And then when you get to the inferential valid cognition, it's pretty close to what the emptiness is, because you're realizing it through your inference, through your reasoning. It's still not the direct taste of emptiness. That falls away when you're in deep meditation on emptiness. And the mind and emptiness, the object, they say they merge like water into water. If you had a glass of water and another glass of water and you kind of poured them together, they become indistinguishable, right? You can't say, oh, there's that one glass and there's the other glass. The subject and object, the mind knowing emptiness and emptiness, the object known, merge like water into water. and you have this unmistakable experience that is, again, your ticket out. You begin to move out of samsara, out of this conditioned existence, towards liberation and enlightenment. Without a doubt, that is the beginning process, and it's irreversible. You don't like fall from that, and suddenly you've got those all that stuff that you got rid of back again. It doesn't come back to you. You erase it, and it's gone once and for all. And you go through a process of this, removing layer by layer. So why that's in this text and why I'm talking about it is because we do need to kind of understand there's a process that is set out for us to be able to attain freedom from all this nonsense. What we're engaging in the remainder of this course is beginning to understand at a bit of a coarser level initially. How are these things all functioning? What are the mechanics of the mind? What is happening? So that we begin to work at that level and begin to understand that we even have some control over our thought processes that are distorting all of that. Then we can get to the deeper level eventually of saying, and I want to remove the ignorance that's driving the whole show. That's together with all of these distorted states of mind. That is even together with some of my wholesome states of mind. Remember the tree of samsara. Both the wholesome states of mind and the unwholesome states that are in the trunk come out of that root of ignorance. The wholesome bring forth, good actions, good branches that bring positive things, the fruits that we have. The negative states of mind, the distortions, bring forth non-virtuous actions that bring forth the suffering fruit. All of that arises from ignorance. When we get rid of that ignorance, we're free of samsara, and we can eventually attain Buddhahood. Yeah.
I don't mean to change the subject, maybe for another time, but the concept of we're trying to understand emptiness a little while back. It would define to me as everything is related to everything else. Is that
so for those online that's saying, this concept of emptiness, is it related to the idea that everything is related to everything else?
Yeah.
We can say that the interdependence of things, the dependent arising kind of nature of things, that everything depends upon other things for its existence, is the flip side of emptiness. That's how things exist, is that they depend upon all these things. They are empty, therefore, of existing independently. So when we say emptiness, we mean empty of independent existence. On the other side is dependent existence and interdependence, exactly as you're pointing out, Ed. So we can say that those two are completely compatible, because a lack of independence means things depend upon other things, right? That's the translation of those two things. No independence, therefore dependence. It's just how you're going to be looking at it. You do have to get to this negation because we have a firm conviction that things exist independently. And that's the distortion that we have, and that's even how things appear, is that they exist independently. So we have to get to a very deep awareness to overcome that, and that is the realization of emptiness. But it's often we're encouraged to do that through understanding how things exist interdependently, how they cannot exist on their own. Thich Nhat Hanh had this wonderful way of referring to that reality. He called it interbeing. Interbeing means that nothing exists on its own. It's all interbeing. Things become, exist in an interdependent way. And it's one of the most marvelous things the Buddha taught. Lama Tsongkhapa himself, the founder of our tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, did a whole praise to this idea of interdependence and dependent arising, things arising on the basis of that. He said this is the most marvelous teaching the Buddha ever gave, because if we understand how things exist in that interdependent way, then we get that they cannot have an independent mode of existence. They can't stand on their own. It's impossible because of embracing that. Anyway, so you're absolutely on target with that. So let me go ahead. I'm going to jump forward a little bit and go back to the slides. There might be a little bit more about yogic direct perception. Through attaining the yogic direct perception of emptiness, the process by which ignorance and all the stains of ignorance are eventually removed is commenced. That's how it starts, is with your initial yogic direct perception of emptiness, where emptiness and the mind realizing it become like water poured into water. So I do want to jump forward then to this whole section, part 4, which is the main part of this text, right? It's from page 71 through 125. This is where we're going to be for the remainder of the time, pretty much, is working with these main minds and mental factors. I already alluded to this a little bit earlier. But let me do a quote or two here from Dalai Lama and Venerable Chodron, their book, The Foundation of Buddhist Practice, which is book 2 of that 10-book series that they've done. That's quite incredible. But anyway, this is where they talk about mental factors. They say learning about mind and mental factors enables us to better understand our mind. We will be able to identify in our own experience the mental factors that arise due to pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings, and that in turn create the causes of happiness and suffering by motivating the actions or karma that we do. Such introspective awareness of our own mental processes is essential in order to tame and transform our mind. So I'm just sharing that because it's reiterating why we're doing this. Again, why are we spending this time every Thursday night for 11 Thursdays investigating this topic? Because we want to tame our minds. We want to transform our minds. So we have to know how the mind works. And we have to understand, again, these crazy roommates, as Venerable Robina would say, the things that are all going on in our minds that we identify with and put forward and even support that are not worth supporting because they only lead us into trouble. We will also understand that Dharma practice entails subduing the destructive mental factors that lead to misery and psychic existence and enhancing the constructive ones that lead to happiness in psychic existence, as well as to liberation and full awakening Buddhahood. This in turn will positively affect our thoughts, words, and deeds. Everything starts with our minds. What we say and what we do in this embodied form with relation to other beings, it all starts with our minds. So when we work on our minds, we are able to accomplish all of what's on the screen here. Get rid of those destructive mental factors that lead to misery, enhance and accentuate the constructive ones that lead to happiness. I'm going to be doing a talk on Sunday for Thupten Norberling. I may have even mentioned this last Thursday. That's all about kind of the science of happiness. And really, Buddhism embraces this whole concept that what we're trying to do, and these two work in tandem, is to remove what is destructive and unwholesome and really dangerous for us, and enhance what is the most constructive, positive states of mind that we can. And the finished product of being a Buddha is essentially somebody who's done that full work, removed everything that is negative from the mind, and developed everything that is positive. That's the meaning of that word that we recited in the Tibetan refuge prayer, Sangye. Sang means to completely purify. Gye means to fully develop. But what's interesting in the approach in Buddhist psychology is that we're doing these simultaneously, because the more we develop positive states of mind, the more that they are antidotes to the negative states of mind. This is what I'm going to be presenting a little bit on Sunday in a very short teaching, and like an hour and a half teaching. I won't have time to go into the detail I'm doing in this course. But we'll talk about that even in this course. When we cultivate these positive states of mind, they're antidotes. They're ways of counteracting the negative states, things that are problematic in our minds. So this is also a part of kind of Buddhist psychology that we'll be getting into. But what His Holiness and Venerable Chodron are saying there is that when we do this work, well then, it has an effect on our thoughts, our words, our deeds, and eventually helps us to be free from all this nonsense. So when we talk about these two, if we take the whole lump experience that we call consciousness, which is really in the nature of experience, consciousness, mind, awareness, those can be seen as kind of synonyms. That can be divided into main minds and mental factors. I mentioned this earlier tonight, but let's look at this little kind of description of what we mean by these. A main mind is a main knower that is posited by way of simply apprehending the entity of its object. The categories of that are on the next screen, I think. Oh, no, I'll put them a little further. The categories of that are the 5 sense consciousnesses and our mental consciousness. You have 6 consciousnesses. These are your 6 main minds. The definition of a mental factor, on the other hand, it's a knower as well. It's a part of our consciousness that apprehends any of the features of its object, accompanies whatever main mind is concomitant with it. Concomitant means it's arising at the same time and having similarities with that. So essentially we have in this study that we're going to be getting into, and that whole list of mental factors, I showed you there's a chart with like 51 mental factors. It's simply a way for us to conceptualize the different functional pieces of our minds, to understand some of them that do play a very basic functionality. This is what we're going to move into if we have time tonight, is the 5 ever-present mental factors or omnipresent mental factors that play a role anytime we're active in knowing anything, which is pretty much all the time, right? They say there's very rare moments where we wouldn't have those present. Those are omnipresent. They are always the basic structure about how the mind is functioning. And it's just a simple way of kind of parsing up those various parts of our experience. Don't think of them as being so concrete or anything. They're just simply a part of the full experience we're having with our main mind, our mental consciousness or eye consciousness, ear consciousness, whatever. So essentially, those mental factors are a way for us to look at the mind and to parse up, this is this is that. We're going to put them into 6 different categories. Within each of those, you're going to have a number of ones that we're going to look at. But the ones we're going to start with are a bit more functional. They're a bit more about just understanding what's going on whenever we're knowing something. It's very useful. Hopefully you'll get some appreciation for this as we go through this. So this is from Geshe Tashi's book, which I mentioned earlier. It's on your reading list, but again, it's a little complicated in some ways, but it is a nice introduction to all this. He says there are many metaphors to describe the relationship between a main mind, such as, again, any of the 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness, and the mental factors. In some ways, we can see the main mind, this is the analogy that he uses, which I think is really quite useful. That's why I'm sharing it with you. The main mind is kind of like the screen in a cinema. You go to the theater, maybe people don't go to the theater so much anymore, right? But remember sitting in the theater and there's that blank screen, right? That screen is going to have images projected on it. And the images are comparable to the mental factors. The mental factors are what kind of give us the whole experience of what's going on, and it's all happening on the screen. It's all happening within that main mind. So when we have, for example, this, oh, is that Mary Joyce? We've got a phone going up there. We'll wait a moment. No, it's not for me.
Think it's from my phone.
Okay. There it goes. It went to message. Okay. So the idea here is that when we think about the example we used earlier about the eye consciousness with the color blue of the sky, right? There is kind of the bringing in of that data and what have you. The eye consciousness itself is sort of a blank screen, but it's shaped by all the various ways that we are relating to that color blue. The feelings that might come up around it of being pleasant. Maybe we really like that color blue or whatever. All the various things. We're going to get into this detail. But that's what shapes our experience. That's what gives us the movie of our lives. That's what the film is. So going on to the next screen, he says, we never really see the screen when we're sitting in the theater because we're so caught up in the stories that are projected onto it. The mental factors color and determine our understanding of the main mind, which is much more neutral and unadorned. It's like the screen. I mean, you could show a horror movie on the screen, and you could show a love story on the screen, and you can show a documentary on the screen, right? This is comparable to our minds as well. We have these main minds, and we have many different stories that are happening throughout our day of all the various stuff that's being interpreted and experienced and so on. Some of these mental factors are conceptual minds. Some of them are simply part of our raw experience of things. And they can be with our conceptual mind as well. But the idea is that this analogy, I think, is a really useful one to see that we have these main minds that are like the screen, and then we have the mental factors that give shape to all of it. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we have 5 sense consciousnesses that are the 5 sense main minds. And then we have the mental consciousness, which once more, just to reiterate, it mainly is conceptual mental consciousness that uses a mental image. But we also can have, such as that yogic direct perceiver I was talking about earlier, a non-conceptual mental consciousness that perceives its object directly. There's other examples of that, but I'm not going to go into that because, again, this course isn't about replicating these more traditional studies. It's really to get to the nuts and bolts, which I'm anxious to get to. The 51 mental factors that we are going to be examining, some of these in more detail than others. We're going to spend a fair amount of time with these 6 root afflictions, number 4 down here, because these are the problem guys that we need to be attentive to. The virtuous mental factors we'll work with, but often as the antidotes to the afflictions and so on. We have first those 5 I mentioned a short while ago. We call these ever present because they're pretty much present in any moment of consciousness. The 5 focusing or object ascertaining mental factors when we're particularly engaged in an object. Those 2 are worth taking a look at because we can begin to see particularly the role that those play in our Buddhist study and practice. Then the ones that are flavored in a positive way, the 11 virtuous mental factors. And then the next 2 categories are the afflictions or these distorted states of mind, the 6 root ones and the 20 close or secondary ones. And then there are 4 that are kind of variable depending upon what other content is in the mind. They can become more unwholesome versus wholesome, what have you. So, whoops, yeah. Okay, that was just a screen we went through. The 51 mental factors are again in this part, pages 78 to 124. So I'm not going to go to the text so much again tonight. What I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about these 5 in just the remaining minutes that we have. And I'm just going to give you a simple example, and then next week we'll go into more detail, all right? So these 5, intention here is not the way that we often think of intention. What's your intention for coming over here? That type of thing. That's more like a motivation. That's a conceptual thought. Intention is simply the movement towards something that happens whenever our main consciousness is involved with some object. So let's go back to the blue in the sky. We look up through our eye consciousness is becoming aware of the blue. The intention is moving us towards that blue. The mental engagement or attention is what causes us to focus particularly on that aspect of our field of experience. So blue appears, through all the various things that Venerable Gyatso described, right? All of the various factors that cause that blue appearance. We then have an intention moving towards it. We put our attention on it in that way of kind of focusing on it, and we come into contact with it. Contact is meaning that it becomes a part of our experience. Not physical contact necessarily, because in the color blue, you've got just the, again, waves of all of that are producing this impression of blue on your retina and what have you. But the idea is that there has to be some contact between the object and ourselves. That in turn induces what's called a feeling. And feeling here isn't the whole range of all the various emotions that we can have. It's a simple feeling tone. Let me take it off screen here for a moment while I talk about this. There are 3 different feeling tones, if you will. I like to use this. Sometimes I use the word sensation. But the idea is you can have something you experience that's pleasant, something you can experience that's neutral, or something you can experience that's unpleasant. Those are the 3, and you might have gradations within this, right? Something that's extremely pleasant versus something that's mildly pleasant, or extremely unpleasant versus mildly unpleasant. But this is what is happening. We come into contact with an object, our intention has moved us there, we put our attention on it. That contact induces a pleasant feeling. And really, they say this is actually kind of jumping ahead a little bit. That's the ripening of our karma, is to have a particular experience. Brussels sprouts come into contact with my tongue. And initially, when I was tasting them, it was like, unpleasant, right? And then, over time and getting exposed to a whole new way of preparing them, suddenly, it's like, yeah, those are very good, right? All right. So again, that's the basic raw stuff that we're involved in when we're in our sense consciousnesses or even our mental consciousness. That's the way that we bring that information in. The last one of these 5 has to do with it's called discrimination or discernment. And it's the fact that you recognize or discern something as this is this and that is that. And you don't necessarily do it with labels because, again, this can happen even at the level of just a pure sensory experience. So let's say, again, that you have that color of blue that is appearing in the sky. There's already some discrimination within the eye consciousness of that as being separate from the green of the trees around you or the brown of the dirt or whatever the case might be. There's an ability for us, even through our dumb consciousnesses, the 5 sense consciousnesses, to have some discernment or discrimination of this is this and that is that. Obviously, when our conceptual mind gets involved, Then we overlay that discrimination with a lot of other thoughts. It's not just this is blue and different from everything else around it. Then we start thinking, oh, that's a really beautiful blue, and that's the blue I want in my room, and all the other stuff that we go into, right? So these are we're going to, again, examine these again. You're welcome to read ahead. Let me put on the screen, and I will be sure to put these presentation slides out there. Maybe if I don't get to them later tonight, it'd certainly be tomorrow. I'm going to jump forward. There's I'll leave these in there. We'll maybe go through some of them next week. This was the mindfulness exercise that I encouraged you to do a little bit earlier. Pay attention to the way that raw data is brought into your awareness by way of the sense consciousnesses, and then how your conceptual mind begins to process and work with that data to construct your view of reality and the subsequent thoughts about what you are experiencing. That's one that you can work with. And a second one is with this understanding of these 5 ever-present mental factors that operate in every moment of awareness. Try to deconstruct the way that they're functioning when your mind is experiencing various objects, whether they're pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and whether that's through the direct awareness of your sensory consciousnesses or the indirect way that you're knowing it through your conceptual mental consciousness. They're always functioning. And in the meantime, if you also want to read ahead a little bit, well, you can go back again. I have the reading from last week that's already out there on the slides that I showed you on the drive. You can do these additional readings, begin to start working with minds and mental factors. It's not very many pages. Again, just a little bit. I might mention that Venerable Gyatso has a whole section on ego psychology, Western psychology, that I'm not going to teach on. I just feel like it's way beyond what we want to cover here. But these 5 ever-present mental factors are discussed on pages 78 through 81, and I'll reintroduce them next week as well. Once more, this is just the mechanics. Like what is happening is that, again, raw data is appearing to us, and we have that kind of intention that moves us towards it, the attention we give to it, the contact with it that induces a feeling, and then our discrimination that's happening that is this, that is that. That's the very basic stuff that's happening anytime we are knowing anything, which again is pretty much all the time. But the overlays we're going to talk about that we put on top of that are the problem. But we have to understand this mechanism and what's going on there. Kind of get that this is really all that's happening, folks, is you're just having those raw experiences and feelings being induced. And your relationship to all of that stuff is what's either going to be healthy or unhealthy. Kind of getting it? Yeah. Okay. Let's close. We'll see if there's questions, and then we'll close for tonight. Any questions or comments from?
I have.
Yes, Edward.
I find this very difficult, and I'm learning through you. I appreciate it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. It is a bit of a difficult topic, and the beginning here is going to be probably the more difficult because we still are in the level of just mechanics and understanding terminology. When we get into the actual content, I think we're all going to be like going, oh yeah, I know that, because we start talking about attachment and anger and things that we can all relate to that we know are problematic and how we overcome those patterns. Because that's the gist of it. I don't really want to spend too much time in the dirt and the ground here, on all this foundational stuff. I want to get to the topics that really matter. And so thank you for hanging in there and continuing to learn. Yes, Mary Jo.
It seems like not only how things are, but at least I have quite a few friends that seems like they have opinions about so many things. I like that, I don't like that, and kind of like that. And I try to watch that carefully myself. I also have opinions, but that does seem to color our view of things.
Sure,
really.
Sure. Mary Jo is pointing out how, she recognizes this in herself, but she's also seeing in many of her other friends the strong opinions that they have about various things on the basis of, again, a conceptual overlay that we're putting on top of all this. And that's how we're going to see these various experiences that are simply raw experiences, right? And we can see it in ourselves, right? To the degree to which we have opinions, and we might try to lessen some of that and not be so strongly attached to what we think, right? Don't believe everything you think, and don't think that that is some sort of inherently good or inherently bad, whatever. We do this with people a lot. I mean, I think it becomes really problematic when we're doing it with people, right? Because suddenly we pigeonhole somebody on the basis of some raw data that we've received. And I'm not saying again that we're totally condoning everything that that being might be doing. We can have issues with the actions that they're doing, but our opinions about the person are a whole other domain, right? As we're seeing in this course, we all have the potential to practice these teachings and to attain unbelievable states of well-being and to be incredibly kind and compassionate, embody all these virtuous mental factors we're going to talk about. You can do that. But that person, when we put that overlay and have that opinion, we have set it in stone, like that is who they are and that's who they're always going to be. And there's no chance for them, in that type of thinking, because that's who they are. They're this horrible, negative, evil, awful person, and we need to vote them off the island, right? They don't belong here anymore. That's what's going on in our world, right? But it's always been going on in our world because that's what this mind of ignorance does. And the concepts we overlay on top of all of that become the sources of amazing problems in our world. Remember the story, the cute little book, maybe I'll bring it in. I have a copy of it, the Skeeches by Dr. Seuss.
No.
Oh, there's like the Starbelly Skeeches and the no, what do they call the other ones? It's like this whole little story. Anyway, maybe I'll bring it in and
Bring it. Right? I never
the speeches. It's what we're doing in our world. We think, this is right and that is wrong. And then suddenly what was wrong before becomes right. And it becomes this whole game of like, what is right and what is wrong. I mean, I'm not saying it's that reductionist to where you can't find what is right and wrong. The Buddha did set out conventionally things that we say are good and wholesome and bring about good results versus those things that are unwholesome and negative and bring about unfavorable results. But you can't get so hung up in things that are just purely based on opinion and just based on an assessment that really isn't grounded in any truth or logic or reality. So, all right. If you have other questions, please write them down, and we can entertain those in the next class or send them to me. Again, my email address, Don Handrick, like it says on the screen there, Don Handrick, all one word, at yahoo.com. So feel free to write to me. We're going to go to the dedication prayers, prayer list that we have that Jan is going to read, so we can think about those people in particular. And if you have ones that you'd like to add for either obstacles, illness, or who have died or are dying, then let us know at the end and we'll add those to the list.
We dedicate the merit created by listening to this teaching to all beings everywhere on every prayer list. We dedicate for the health and long lives of all our precious teachers. We dedicate for all those experiencing obstacles, specifically Wyatt, Adrian, Stella, Jana, Marie, Tony, Mary Jo, Rolf, Elohim, Aiden, Ed Gillespie, and Yvonne. We dedicate for all those experiencing illness, specifically Jane, Mary Jo, Maria, Libby S., Lou, Bonte P., Kelly, John, Nikki, Cecil, Bill, and Rolf. And for those who are dying or who have died in the last 49 days, Renee Good, Sandra Jackson, Eric, Nate Selby, Alex Pretty, Skunk, and Ben.
So were there any online people that needed to add to the list?
Yes. Can you
Yes.
hear me? Could
Yes,
you
we can
please?
hear you.
Thank you. Could you please add Alyssa to obstacles?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure, Lauren. Anyone else? Okay.
I'd like to add to the ill part, Venerable P. I'm sorry, I don't know the whole name. Monk walking for peace who has lost his leg.
Oh,
Okay. So,
Please.
yeah.
Thank you.
So Mary Jo has asked, not sure of the exact name, but the Venerable that is walking with the monks, they were in Washington, D.C., are in Washington, D.C. still, I think, right now, but one of them lost their leg, and just praying for that monk in particular, but we can also, dedicate for the monks to not have any obstacles as they continue this amazing journey and having a profound impact on people in this world, in this country in particular. So
Yeah,
Let's
just
go.
to clarify that, sorry. I followed him so closely, I just thought I'd chime in. They're actually on a bus going back to Fort Worth right now. They completed
Oh,
their,
I know.
yeah.
Good.
So I
I
just,
wasn't sure. I know they did a huge gathering at the National Cathedral.
yeah, and then, yeah, I was following them so closely. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's wonderful what they
Oh,
do.
it's amazing.
All right. Let's do our prayers. With all those beings in mind, we do the dedication prayers.
Dedication prayers, once in Tibetan. Gewa di nyo da
La sa
ge dru yo ne
dro chin pyang ma lu
ba
de sa go pa
sho John Chu Sam Cho Rinpoche Ma Ke Pa Nam Ke Gyurche Ke Wa Nam Pa Me Pa Yang Gong Ne Gong Yu Fel War Sho. Long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the wish granting, wish fulfilling
jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech. May all your holy
Your holy
wishes be
wishes be
spontaneously
spontaneously
fulfilled.
and for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, peerless teacher
And assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pradika Buddhas, victorious
Victorious
Losang,
Lodang, Father and Son,
all
so
the
then
lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you were the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. So I might mention that Losar, Tibetan New Year, is coming up on Wednesday. I'll be leading Guru Puja at Thupten Norbaling down the way in Santa Fe from 7 to 8:30, and that'll be online if you would like to join. But keep in mind that first 2 weeks of the new year, from February 18th through March 3rd, March 3rd is the full moon day, and that's said to be Day of Miracles, but the whole thing is generally called the Days of Miracles, when the Buddha exhibited miracles to help convince what are called the Tortikas, the ones who were holding really strongly wrong views, in order to sway them away from those. He rarely did miracles, but had all these various miraculous things that he did. So essentially, this is a very powerful time for practice. So keep that in mind. It's said that according to Lama Zopa Rinpoche and what he found, every meritorious act we engage in, the merit is multiplied by 100 million times. So it's better than double coupon day at the grocery. So keep that in mind. It's like 100 million coupon day at the grocery. If you could imagine such a thing, they'd be giving you money just for handing out coupons.
John, is there gonna be precepts online?
Yeah, I'm wondering.
I don't know what's happening with that on Losar. On the 3rd, I think someone is going to be here. Elaine Jackson is going to be in Santa Fe doing precepts online. But on Losar, I'm not sure. I don't know if the center's got somebody lined up to lead precepts. I'm going to do the puja, but I haven't been asked to do that, and they may have somebody. Precepts, my 8 Mahayana precepts are very powerful again for those 2 days in particular, but also every day in between if you can do it for a period of time. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Be well, and
Thank you,
be back here again next Thursday. And,
Yay.